G'day guys, welcome to my second Nottorus tutorial. This one's in response to the Unity 3D forums. Someone requested how to count instances of an object and then do something with those objects based on the count. So I'm going to create a little game here where we just throw some balls out onto a field, count the balls and then join them to another object after. So I'm just going to start with a blank scene here, just a camera and a light. I've made three materials, blue, green and red. And I've imported Nottorus already. So once you've set up that scene, the first thing we're going to do is create the playing field by creating a plane, reset it to 0. We want it to be quite large to throw the balls onto, so scale it by 10. I'm going to give it the green material and just zoom out a little bit. The next thing we want to do, I want the camera to be on this back edge here along the Z-axis. So it's going to be around there, which will be about -50. And we also want to give the camera a little bit of height and angle it down so we can get a good look at the playing field. So we'll give it 4 high and we'll rotate it 26 on the X-axis. So we've got a good look down on the playing field now. Okay, so the next thing we need is a few prefabs to use in the game. So we're going to create a couple of folders. First one will be for the prefabs, and we'll create another one to put our Nottorus scripts in. Okay, so the first prefab we're going to create is the ball, which we're going to be throwing out into the field. So we're just going to create a sphere. Move it up a little bit. We're going to give the sphere a blue material. We're going to scale it to 0.5. And because we want to influence with physics, we're going to give it a rigid body component. So add component, physics, rigid body. We don't want the balls to roll away, so we'll give it some angular drag. 0.25 was a good value. And that's the first prefab. The second prefab we need is a cube to join the balls onto after we get to a certain amount. So again, we'll go create the 3D object cube to move it out of the way a bit. We'll give this the red material. Again, we'll scale it to 0.5. This will also need a rigid body component. So add physics, rigid body. And because we want the cube to pull the balls toward itself, we're going to make it heavier than the balls. So we'll give it a mass of 10 so that the balls don't pull the cube around too much. Now for the way I've set this game up, we're going to need one more prefab, and it's just going to be an empty game object. So create an empty, and we'll just give it a name of ball container. And it's just going to hold the balls in after we've manipulated them. Okay, so that's the three objects we need prefabs. So we'll move them into the prefabs folder. Cube and sphere, and we can remove them from the scene. Now the next thing we want to do is create another empty game object at our camera location, and this is going to be the object which we attach our scripts to, and it's going to be where the objects shoot out from into the scene. So create an empty game object, and we'll just give it a name, shooter object. We want to position it the same place as the camera, which was 4 high, -50. So it's at the same location as your camera. We don't want any angle on it though, because we want the objects to shoot out that way. And that's the scene set up and ready to go. So we can start scripting now. So we'll open Nottorus script editor. Create a new script. It's going to be a mono behavior. Put it into our scripts folder, and we'll call this shoot balls. Okay, so the first thing we need is 3 class variables, public variables, that will hold our prefab game objects so that we can spawn them into the game. So we do that by adding our class variables here. The First one we want is the ball object. It's going to be a game object, and it's going to be public. And we repeat this for the cube object. Again, we want a game object, and then one for our container as well. Again, game object. So we'll save it at this stage. Always remember to save often, because you can make changes in Unity, and if you haven't saved, you can lose some of your graph. So saving often is a good tip. Okay, so now that we've created our public variables, we can create our first function now. And this function is going to shoot the balls out at the mouse location. So we'll call it mouse shoot. Okay. The first thing we want to do in this function is check if the mouse button has been clicked. So just do a get mouse button down is the node that we're after. Mouse button 0 is the left mouse button. So now we want to do a check to see if it's been pressed. So we do a flow if. So if our mouse button has been pressed, then we want to create a ball into the scene. So we're going to be creating a ball. How do we do that? By using the Instatiate function. The object we want to create is the ball object. The position and rotation, we want it to match our shooter object. And our script will be attached to shooter object. So we get our transform from the inherited properties. The first thing we want is our position. And the second one is the rotation. So these are our position and rotation that we're going to move the ball object to when it's being created. Okay, now this function is going to create an object which we can make a local variable of. And over here we can rename it to new ball. We want this ball though to be a game object, not just an object. So we'll give it game object type. And then we're going to add a cast in the middle here to cast this object as a game object. So we do that by using as type. The object is going to be a game object. And then it automatically picks it up from the object we've connected it to. Okay. So if we've pressed the mouse button, create a ball. We're going to save here. Okay, so this ball now is going to be created at our shooter object location. What do we want to do with it? We want to shoot it out, so we're going to add some force to the ball. So we're going to add force. And we want the 3D rigid body, not 2D. So 3D, add force. That will be the next step in the sequence. Where do we get our rigid body from? It will be from our new ball. So from our new ball, we're going to get component. And the component we want is the rigid body. How much force do we want to add to it? We're going to get that from our mouse location in the game. So we do that by getting our mouse position. Mouse position. Input mouse position. This is going to create a vector 3, but it won't have any depth to it on the z-axis. So we need to add some depth to it. So we'll do that by creating a new vector 3. And we're going to give it some depth. We'll give it 500 for this example. In this example, this is relative to the scene. So -50 is around here, 0 is around there, 500 would be out there somewhere. We're going to add these together using math. Our resultant vector 3 will now have our mouse position and Z of 500. This position is relative to the mouse position. We want it in world coordinates, so we want screen to world. Relative to our main camera. So main camera.main. And this will be our force vector. So after we've given the ball the force, the next thing we want to do is move it into our shooter object as a child. And I want to do that so that when we count them, we know which ones we're counting. So to do that, we're going to do a set parent, transform set parent. The transform we want to move is our balls transform. And the parent we want is the shooter object transform, which again we can get from the inherited properties. So the next stage is to set the parent, save and compile. And now we'll go to our update function, put our mouse shoot into the update. Again, save and compile. And we should be ready to start shooting some balls into the scene. So we're going to grab our script from the scripts folder. We're going to attach that to our shooter object. We need to assign our prefabs to the 3 variables that we created. So the ball container is that one, the cube is that one, and the sphere is the ball. We'll save our game. And all gone to plan, we should be able to shoot some balls out into this scene now. And it follows the mouse nicely, as you can see. Okay, so the next stage is to count the balls. When we get to 4, we want to create a cube now and join those balls onto the cube. So we're going to go back to our script editor. We're going to create a new function. We'll call this count balls. Save. Now there's 2 ways we can go about checking how many balls there are. The first way would be to get all the child objects of shooter object, and then if it's equal to 4, then we know we have 4 balls. That works until we start adding other objects though. What I'm going to do though is create a tag and give the balls their own tag so that we can cycle through all those game objects with that tag and then check if they're a child of this object. So we're going to create a tag, we'll call it ball. We're going to assign that tag to the sphere objects. So our spheres that are created will have the tag ball. So now in our script editor, we can use the function find game objects with tag. The tag that we want to find is obviously ball. What do we want to do with our game objects? We want to save them into an array. We'll call this array ball objects. Okay, so that is our first stage. The next thing we want to do is cycle through all of the balls that we've found in the game. So we're going to do that with a for each loop. So for each game object that we found, we want to check that it's going to be a child of shooter object. So we do that by comparing the two transforms. So is this transform parent equal to this transform? I'm going to do a simple comparison. So if the ball's parent is equal to shooter object, then we want to count them. So we're going to create a local variable called ball count. It's just going to be an integer. So ball count equals ball count add 1. Now if ball count is equal to 4, then we want to create the cube. So we do that by doing another comparison. So if they're equal, so if ball count is equal to 4, then we want to instantiate our cube, and we also want to instantiate our container. We'll do the cube first, and the easiest way we can do this is by copying the same routine from our mouse shoot function. So we'll save and compile this so we don't lose anything. Go back to mouse shoot, find our instantiate section. We want all of this plus this. So copy that, go back to our count balls function, paste it there. There's a couple of things we need to change. Instead of new ball, which got created over here, we want new cube. And instead of the ball object, we want the cube object. So that will now create our cube. The next thing we want to do is create our ball container. And because we don't need to move this anywhere else, we can do this in a simpler way. We can just do it using the instantiate again. We want to instantiate the ball container. And set its type to a game object. And this will be promoted to a variable, which we'll call new container. And that is the next step that we need to take. I'm going to save and compile again. Okay, so now what we have, we count all the balls in the game. If it's equal to 4, we create a cube and we create our ball container. And the cube is moved into our shooter object location again. So now what we want to do is shoot the cube out into the scene. And we do that again by adding force to it. So we're going to add force again. The rigid body we want to add force to is the cube. So we're going to get component. Component we want is rigid body. Now the force we want to add is going to be created from a new vector. Vector 3. Where do we get the values from? We're going to make it a random throw out into the game field. So we're going to create 3 random numbers here. So random range. Just copy and paste that. This will be our X random number, our Y and our Z. Now the range we want, don't forget we've got a lot more mass on the cube, so we need some fairly high values. So for the X, we'll go negative 3000 to 3000. Y, we want a little bit of height, so it throws the cube up in the air a bit. The minimum will be 1000. We'll go up to 3000. And the depth, we want it to be fairly wide range, so we'll go 2000 to 6000. So this will be our resultant force vector. So after we've created our container, we add force to the cube's rigid body. So we're going to test that quickly. Before we can do that, we need to add this routine into the update function. Save and compile again. One, two, three, 4. And because there's 4 balls, it's going to keep creating cubes. So now that we've created a cube, what do we want to do? We want to make our balls join onto the cube. The way I've decided to do that in this tutorial is by using spring joints. So to do that, we're going to go to our cube prefab. We're going to add component, physics, spring joint. We want to turn off auto configure. We want a lot of spring. And we want to be smooth, so we're fairly high damper as well. So spring 200, damper 50, auto configure off. We want the balls to hit the cube so they don't go through it. So enable collision. And where do we want the balls? We want 1 on each side of the cube. So X1 and X negative 1, Z1 and Z negative 1. So the first one will be X1. Now instead of repeating that 3 more times, we can just copy this component and paste it 3 times and just change our anchor points. So instead of 1, we want negative 1 on X, then we want 1 on Z, and negative 1. So we've got a spring joint on each side of the cube that we can attach the balls to. Okay, so now we can go back to our script editor, to our count balls function. How we're going to attach these balls to the spring joint. We're going to create an array of the spring joints, and then we're going to cycle through the balls and attach 1 to each spring joint in the array. So how do we create an array of the spring joints? We do that by getting the components from our new cube. Get components. The component that we want is the spring joint. We're going to create an array of the spring joints by creating a local variable. We'll call that spring joints. So we create our array of spring joints. The next thing we want to do is use our ball count variable as an index now to this array. So the first thing we're going to do is reset it back to 0. We're going to create a for each loop again and cycle through all of our ball objects. We need to do the check again to make sure that they are a child of shooter object. So we can actually copy that from here again. That's this section here, where we check to see if it is a child of our object. We then copy that and paste that there. The game object we want to check is the one that we're cycling through in our for each loop. So if it was a child, a shooter object, then we want to add one to our ball count, which is now our index counter. So again, we're going to add one to this. We're going to get the spring joint value based on this index. So we need to get the array value, or array element, I should say, sorry. So the array is going to be our spring joints. The index value is going to be our ball count, remembering though that arrays start at 0, so we need to take 1 from the ball count. Minus 1. That's going to be our index value. Okay, so now we've got the next spring joint in the array. We need to attach the rigid body of the ball. So the ball is coming from this loop here. So we want to get a component. We want the rigid body. And we need to attach it to the connected body of this spring joint. So we want to get the connected body. Connected body will be this rigid body from our ball. And we're going to set that. So now we've attached the ball to the spring joint. Next thing we want to do is move it to our new container. We want to set the parent. Transform, set parent. The transform we want is our ball transform from this loop, which we've got here. And the parent we want to be the new container. And going to plan. That should move out of our shooter object so it doesn't get counted in the next update. So make sure you save and compile again. And if I've done everything correctly, our game should be working. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. And there we go. So there's a couple of other changes we could have done after we joined the object. We could untag the balls so they're not getting added to the loop. And as I mentioned earlier, the other way we could have got the objects is just to get the children of this object only instead of doing the find objects with tag. So that's the end of the tutorial. I hope it helped a few people out there and helps you understand how to use Nottorus a little bit better. If there's any questions, feel free to leave them on the YouTube channel or on the Unity forums under the Nottorus plugin. Thanks for watching.